Hello again, comrades. Hello, hello, hello. 再次大家好, as we say here in China. Welcome to the 5th episode of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Drew Smith, and it's always a pleasure to be back in the studio. As you know, National Day holiday was upon us this first week of October, and whoa, boy, was it raining. Most of the holiday was spent indoors, with the exception of one outing with my ex-partner. I got some Chongqing-style hot pot with some Communist Party comrades. And also we went to a couple of museums, which, of course, you know, history guy, never have a problem with that. Still, for the most part, I spent my days indoors working on a paper with a history department colleague about Islamic evangelical movements in Pakistan. So we're hoping to get that published soon. It'll be nice to be published once again. And then I ended up getting back onto online learning. Now, you know, with my students, they're pretty compliant when it comes to online learning compared to last university students, but it's still a pain in the ass, to say the least, for us teachers and professors to get anything really done. You know, it's hard to have fun in the digital classroom. It really is. And what makes it even worse is I'm one of those professors who lives on campus in the faculty apartments, so I've been on lockdown alongside my students. So in a way, I have to relive the old college experience each time the Xi'an Municipal People's Government implements a lockdown. But I mean, what can you do? At least I don't have to deal with the ivermectin guzzling anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers back home in the States. But seriously, folks, I guess it's time for us to get back to the chronological narrative of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. I mean, don't get me wrong, having Uncle Zhang as my guest host for episode 4 was a serious treat, and he has expressed interest in making guest appearances in later episodes, especially when we get to the points where we talk about the 70s, because, you know, that's going to be more of the time that he remembers. But right now, let's catch up on what happened across September and October of 1966. So in episode 3, we ended it with Mao, the Central Cultural Revolution group, and the party center pulling the plug on Red August at the second Red Guard rally in Tiananmen Square, especially because the Daching massacre was such a horrible disaster and went entirely against the August 8th 16-point circular, particularly point 6, where Mao said, "Correctly handle the contradictions among the people. Conduct debate through reasoning and not by force, and as much as possible distinguish between antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions among comrades." Still, despite the mass killings and pogroms being temporarily put to an end by Mao's directives at the Second Red Guard rally, that didn't stop the Red Guards from continuing their campaign of vandalizing ancient historical sites, destroying cultural relics, mass burning of antique books, as well as the looting of homes of, quote, bad elements in society that were suspected of hiding antiques and artifacts from the, quote, old society. Let me actually backtrack and recap a wee bit from some of the Red Guard attacks on property that I briefly mentioned in episode 3. So, meanwhile, while the Jiaxing massacre was going on, the Destroy the Four Olds campaign continued in a frenzied earnest. In my last episode, I mentioned how the Red Guards spent the last week of August looting department stores and destroying any Western-style clothing, like t-shirts, blue jeans, leather jackets, and three-piece suits, and Hong Kong or Republican-era style Chinese clothing like cheongsongs or qipaos. Men and women proudly cut their hair short in order to get rid of Western hairstyles like pompadours, slickbacks, and perms. In episode 3, I also mentioned how famous restaurants like Chuangzhou Beijing Roast Duck Restaurant were ransacked by high school Red Guards, their antique decor destroyed, and the restaurants redecorated with portraits of Mao and Red Guard propaganda posters. In episode 3, I told you guys that many street signs around China had their names changed to things like Anti-Revisionist Road, Revolution Road, Eternal Struggle Boulevard, and Hamler and Sickle Square. Nothing from the old world was to remain unchanged in the eyes of the Red Guards, who felt that any trace of the pre-1949 world would be fertile soil for the rightists within the party to rebuild the old world and restore capitalism and semi-feudalism. Across the last week of August and across the entire month of September, Red Guards would tear down ancient statues of various emperors, sages, and generals in all the major city centers. Portraits of the 9 marshals of the People's Liberation Army, such as Peng Dehuai and Zhu De, who had sided with the right wing of the party, were torn down and burned along with paintings and murals of dynastic-era Chinese heroes. For the most zealous of the young Red Guards, anything that reeked of pre-revolutionary China was to be destroyed. Some of these things deemed part of the old world could sometimes be rather shocking, even from a Maoist point of view. For example, because Tian Han, the composer of the Chinese national anthem, March of the Volunteers, he sided with Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping in the struggle. So because of that, March of the Volunteers was de facto banned in China and was replaced with the Internationale and the East is Red at nearly all state functions and at all rallies. Women, while not officially forbidden by law to wear makeup or jewelry, were told to keep makeup and jewelry to a minimum because it was seen as a method for women to placate what I guess we would call today the male gaze. And makeup and jewelry in general had connotations pertaining to the painted faces popular in the Forbidden City Imperial Palace and in Peking Opera. Here in Xi'an, the call to destroy the old world was heard across the month of September, October, and into early November. On September 2nd, here at Northwest University, where I teach, the Red Guards occupied the library and proceeded to haul as much of the library's collection out of the building and spent the rest of the week holding mass book burnings of antique texts and other things deemed of bourgeois liberal outlook, or books written by party members deemed as targets for the revolution. Elsewhere in Xi'an and in the surrounding countryside of Shanxi, the 3rd century Daxing Shan Temple, the 6th century Jingye Temple, the 2nd century Wolong Temple, the 12th century 8 Taoist Immortals Temple, and the 7th century Xingjiao Temple either sustained heavy damage or were destroyed entirely by local high school Red Guards. In November, Bamboo Market Street, which is the street that leads to the Drum Tower in Lianhu District, was renamed Revolutionary Street, and the old decor lining the streets was replaced with revolutionary symbols, posters, and murals. There is actually one funny story from here in Xi'an, though, that I was personally told by the Imam of the Grand Mosque in Xi'an. In late September, a group of Red Guards marched through the Muslim quarter, or as we call it, Huiminjie, and were prepared to burn down the Great Mosque. But the Imam of the time, he was a clever one, so what did he do? He posted a portrait of Chairman Mao at the gates of the mosque and decorated the mosque's courtyard with banners of revolutionary slogans and the banners of various ethnically Hui rebel groups. Confused as to what to say, the Imam told the Red Guards, "Worry not, comrades. This mosque has been liberated and made red, and you wouldn't want to destroy any portraits of Chairman Mao or the banner of your fellow rebels, particularly Minzu rebels." Minzu means like national minority. Would you? The Red Guard detachment, unable to come up with a good counter-argument, dispersed and rerouted their march towards a compound of nearby government buildings to attack. Good times, good times. Across China, Red Guards were given free range by the police, army, and militia to ransack suspicious people's homes, tearing homes up from top to bottom. Anything remotely resembling something from the Chiang Kai-shek period, warlord period, or something that could be interpreted as evidence of collaboration with the Japanese during World War II could land you in serious trouble. Money, antiques, precious jewelry stashed away for safekeeping were all confiscated and turned over to the local PSB or PLA garrison. No matter how big or small, anything to do with the old world, even if it was just a tiny knickknack gathering dust in someone's private domicile, needed to be confiscated and destroyed lest it become the seed for the rejuvenation of old customs and thus set a precedent for capitalist restoration in the future. I will say, though, and call me crazy, I will say the Destroy the Four Olds campaign was not entirely bad. I know I've painted a pretty dismal picture so far, but hear me out. And hang on, let me get a sip of water. Just enough to wet my whistle. But yeah, it was also, it had its good points. It was a time where abusive parents were finally able to be challenged without the children fearing the weight of Confucian filial piety. Women whose husbands would beat them could finally report their abusers to local Red Guard or rebel groups, and those abusers would be taken care of in the most brutal of ways. Rapists, child molesters, party members who were laundering money or taking bribes, police officers who racially profiled national minorities. Good luck trying to beg for mercy from the Red Guards, because 99% of the time your self-criticisms would fall on deaf ears. The Destroy the Four Olds campaigns had some other good points. Gambling addiction was a major problem in Chinese society even after the revolution. And the Red Guards were very keen on burning down gambling dens and beating to death those who went around collecting gambling debts from the poor. The few remaining pimps and drug dealers that had remained from the 1950s anti-vice campaigns were ratted out and given the punishments they deserved. Dowry and bride prices, which were officially abolished in 1949 when it came to preparing for marriages, were further combated, and simplified Chinese characters were even further popularized, particularly in rural areas and working-class neighborhoods where people, particularly the elderly, were still struggling with literacy. In rural areas, methods of predicting agricultural output that were based on superstition were phased out by education of the peasantry by Red Guards, and people were taught socialist-style agriculture in places where the Great Leap Forward a decade beforehand had either not taken hold or had failed in its modernization attempts. So again, like I keep saying in every episode, context, context, context. And always, when it comes to the Cultural Revolution, like any other historical revolutionary period, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. While all this destruction may seem horrific and shocking to us modern Westerners, it should be understood that the party viewed the Red Guards as the initial shock troops to demolish the superstructure upon which the rightists in the party were legitimizing themselves in a nationalistic manner. You see, here's why there was such a connection between, all these antiquities and the right wing of the party. Many party rightists, like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, saw themselves as, quote, protectors of 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, a la today's Falun Gong Shenyun dance troops. And a lot of them hoped to use those credentials to permanently stall the march to communism in the name of defending China. Indeed, many scholars hypothesize that Mao had hoped that the Destroy the Four Olds campaign's goal to paralyze the rightists and their nationalist credentials would end in less than a year, so then he could launch into phase 2 of the revolution, build the new world. Because remember, what was the full Slogan, destroy the old world to build the new world. And remember what I said in episodes 1 and 2 about Mao's theory about the superstructure being a key battleground against the bourgeoisie after the establishment of socialism and proletarian rule? Well, this is just an example of how many Red Guards, particularly Red Guards in junior high school and high school, interpreted his theory about the superstructure in excessive and dogmatic ways. So important to remember that. Not all of China's ancient heritage was destroyed during this period, though. The People's Liberation Army, People's Armed Police, and People's Militia would often station themselves around Chinese cultural sites and UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The Party Center and Central Military Commission both agreed places like the Forbidden City, the Great Wall of China, the Summer Palace, and all the provincial museums were to be protected by martial law so that teen Red Guards wouldn't end up destroying parts of the old society that were not in and of themselves remnants of oppression. Mao and the army were definitely supportive of destroying the old world to build the new world, but they realized that you had to have some common sense, especially when it came to the most iconic historical tourist attractions that China had to offer. And I want to reiterate yet again that the campaign to destroy the Four Olds was not simply a campaign to destroy China's 5,000-year-old history, however. Like I said, it was also a campaign to clean house in both the party and within the Red Guard movement itself, so that the Red Guard movement would be ready to eventually segue into the second phase of the campaign, build the new world. And here's where we need to talk about the political terrain of the Red Guard movement in China as a whole, with all of its consolidations, splits, and reconsolidations, as well as its interactions with the broader party apparatus. Now, in episode 3, I told you guys about how easily fractured the Red Guard movement was even from the beginning. And after Red August, the fluctuation of splitting, reconsolidating, and resplitting just kept going and going and going. In fact, I could make a whole 2-hour episode just on the autumn 66 Red Guard factional struggles in Beijing alone. But I'm going to try to keep this short. And you might want to get a pen and pad to keep note of all the different factions, because this actually gets a bit tricky. This actually does get a bit tricky. And in fact, this is why I think everyone should get a copy of Andrew G. Wilder's Fractured Rebellion, because in it he has an appendix of all the different Red Guard factions and their relationship to each other and what campuses they were based out of, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, pick that book up. You won't regret it, because it will help make this part of the podcast a lot less confusing. So by the first week of September, the Red Guard factions that still held the most influence were the kids from the, quote, Red households. Whether or not these factions held a radical Maoist line or not didn't matter on many campuses. As long as you came from a, quote, Red family, you were automatically a, quote, good Red Guard. I talked about this in episode 3, but I think it's important to get a quick refresher to see why the Red Guard factionalism didn't settle down even after Red August had ended. The, quote, Red household Red Guards were the majority faction, so according to Andrew G. Wilder, felt like the work team problem had been solved and there was no need to keep fighting a battle that already had been won. Why chase ghosts? The minority faction, however, felt that the damage done by the work team still needed to be undone, and that pro-work team elements were still a problem on campus. Just because the work teams were gone didn't mean their supporters weren't. The minority factions in the end got the official approval of Mao and the CCRG. There were also factions of students that, while officially pro-cultural revolution, were openly opposed to the Red Guard movement entirely. Those groups were called the Scarlet Guards and the Picket Corps. and were often used to defend government offices from Red Guard mobs. In the wake of the Dachshund massacre in Red August, many Red Guard organizations tried to consolidate around a united line. On September 1st, the, quote, Capital City Red Guard HQ, aka the First Red Guard headquarters, was founded out of a coalition of so-called majority factions. Jiangqing, while officially aligned with the minority factions, gave her blessing, and at the founding Congress of the First HQ, Nie Wanze, Zhou Enlai, and Wang Rengzhong chaired the meeting and gave speeches encouraging the Red Guards to keep line struggle primary and physical violence secondary so as to not repeat the same mistakes as Red August. 4 days later, however, and let me get another drink of water because this is going to take some time. 4 days later, however, the Red Guards split again, this time with the minority factions and a handful of outlying majority factions consolidating around their own Congress, the Second Red Guard headquarters. Oddly, Jiangqing and the CCRG announced that they would support both Red Guard HQs equally, and the CCRG put Xie Fuji and Lu Jijiang in charge of the second HQ. But a day later, a coalition of ultra-radical minority factions came together and formed the Revolutionary Rebel Headquarters, aka the Third Red Guard HQs. 1, 2, 3 Red Guard HQs. As you can see, guys, things were precarious because the rebellion was already split 3 ways in a matter of days. Red August hadn't been even over but maybe a week, and the rebellion had already split again. And in one report by Red Guard leader and main bloodline theory proponent Tanlin Lifu, it was noted that the minority factions were gaining strength and had support of Mao and his allies. But the majority faction were still mainly the children of revolutionary veterans and trade union officials who had serious proletarian credentials and birthright. The minority factions, however, countered Tan Li Fu in saying that it was correct line, not class origin or birth, that should determine who was and who wasn't a revolutionary. And, I think that would be pretty apparent because that's something that Marx, Engels, and Lenin argued themselves. The struggle was also sharpening in the colleges who were under the direction of the particular ministry. For example, the Beijing Geology Institute, which was run by the Ministry of Geology, the Beijing Aeronautics Institute, which was run by the Ministry of Aviation, etc., and a few others. The Red Guards in these particular colleges and trade schools saw themselves as having a particular responsibility to destroy the old world within their respective government ministries, and oftentimes were some of the most militant in Beijing. On September 5th, the Geology Institute East is Red Guard stormed the Ministry of Geology and occupied the building, taking the ministry bureaucracy hostage and declaring an overthrow of the bourgeois reactionary line in both their college and in the ministry. After 3 days, the Geology Institute Picket Corps sent 800 of their own into the building and declared the occupation counter-revolutionary, and a brutal brawl broke out, injuring hundreds. The Picket Corps dragged the leaders of the Geology East is Red Guards back to campus and confined them in classrooms turned into makeshift prison cells where they beat and tortured them. The Aeronautics Institute East is Red Guard movement also fractured into factions, which either supported occupying the Ministry of Aviation building immediately and those who thought such an attack would be premature. Eventually, Zhou Enlai had to step in and tell the kids, once again, stop resorting to violence unnecessarily when they could simply engage in comradely line struggle. Naturally, though, such calls fell on deaf ears. On Tsinghua University campus, The Red Guards split between the official Tsinghua Red Guards and Kwai Da-Fu's Jingshang Red Guards, which was officially sponsored by Zhang Chongchao and Jiang Qing. And yes, keep in mind this group. The Jingjiangshang Red Guards from Tsinghua, led by Kwai Da-Fu, will end up becoming one of the most important Red Guard factions in all of China across the next 2 years. Soon at Beida, which had been known for its relatively stable Red Guard movement, an affiliated Beida Jingangshang Red Guards minority faction was eventually set up in opposition to Niao Wanzan's majority faction. With all this going on, Mao decided it was time for yet another Red Guard rally to keep the movement united and focused on the main goal. On September 15th, 1 million Red Guards filled up Tiananmen Square for the third reception of the Red Guards. It had all the trappings of the first two rallies. Hundreds of thousands of chanting youth, workers, and soldiers waving little red books in a chopping motion, waving red flags, holding up massive portraits of Chairman Mao, Mao waving quietly to the crowd from the Tiananmen Gate roster, Lin Biao giving yet another incendiary speech. You know, the works. This rally, alongside its ostensible purpose of continuing to consolidate and invigorate the Red Guard movement and strike fear into the hearts of the rightists within the party even more, was a bit different from the other rallies. For one thing, representatives from the old pro-Moscow Communist Party of Australia were in attendance, which, to my knowledge, makes it the first Red Guard rally to have an official foreign Communist Party delegation present on the Tiananmen Gate roster. Zhou Enlai gave a rousing militant speech, much more militant than his usual Red Guard rally speeches, but in it he warned the Red Guards to make sure to not disrupt economic production in the midst of their Destroy the Four Olds campaign or in their revolutionary networking campaign, which I'll get to in a second when it comes to the networking. Kang Shang also made a speech, one that rivaled Lin's in terms of vitriol and violence towards the capitalist voters within the party. And just like the first two Red Guard rallies, the reception filled the youth with almost religious ecstasy and zeal. And despite Zhou's calls for the Red Guards to focus their destruction in methodical ways, the smashing of the old world continued. In the midst of all this rampage and rancor, something truly amazing happened that, in my opinion, was one of the most progressive and positive aspects of the early Cultural Revolution, and that one that almost every former Red Guard I've ever met remembers with a smile and a twinkle in their eye. Revolutionary networking. Goodness, dry mouth today. If you haven't figured it out yet, by September of '66, the Red Guard movement was still mainly confined to 3 or 4 urban centers, particularly Beijing. Sure, provincial capitals like Xi'an, Lhasa, Changsha, Chengdu, Fuzhou, Nanjing, they had their factions, but they weren't the storm centers of the revolution like Beijing was. Red Guards from the provinces wanted to be at ground zero of the bombarding of the headquarters, because when you're a 19-year-old college freshman at some lower-tier tech college in Qinghai or Inner Mongolia, rebelling against the local revisionists might make you feel like you're taking a backseat to history. So between August 18, 1966 and the eventual power seizures of the January storm of '67, Red Guards from all over China, and I mean all over China, loaded themselves onto the famous China Railway green trains and headed to Beijing to see Chairman Mao themselves and take part in the numerous Red Guard rallies. Realizing this was going to be a big issue, on September 5th, the Central Committee and the State Council issued a joint notice stating that all travel and boarding expenses for youth traveling to Beijing were to be completely free of charge, and for all dormitories of schools, factories, and even military garrison barracks were to become lodging for the revolutionary guests. The party declared, "The rebels are one big family, and that the citizens of Beijing should treat these youngsters just like their own children. Now, as an aside, let me tell you, I have been on a green train through northwestern China, and it's a very long experience. I'm sure you guys might remember that I told you I went from Xi'an here in Shanxi province to Urumqi in Xinjiang, all the way through Gansu province and a good bit of eastern Xinjiang. And it took me 30 hours one way and 36 hours back. I took the green train because the high-speed trains between my town out to the boonies like Xinjiang and Tibet are either still under construction or are very, very expensive. And you got to remember that in '66, they were decades away from even the very first high-speed rail, like the ones you catch between Beijing and Tianjin or Shanghai and Nanjing. I know it seems like I'm going off topic, but I just want you guys to get an idea of just how grueling a trip from, say, Lhasa to Beijing might be for a 16-year-old Tibetan Red Guard in 1966 who's never even left their home village. And these trains were packed to the gills, like way overloaded. Kids were sleeping on top of each other, having to use the toilet all at the same time or go out the window. And on some trains, they had a really bad meningitis outbreak happen, and a bunch of kids got really sick. Several even died on the way to Beijing on some of the trains. Some kids went even more hardcore, and to emulate the long march of the 1930s, literally walked to Beijing. It was grueling, and for about 3 months it caused massive disruptions in railway traffic because passenger trains filled with Red Guards legally were given right of way before any industrial transport or PLA troop train. But for a generation of Chinese youth, this was entirely worth it. Like, okay, for kids back in America, cramming you and your hippie pals into a VW microbus or onto a Greyhound with a pound of low-grade swag in each of your satchels to go to San Francisco to see the Grateful Dead play at the Fillmore, man, or to go to Woodstock, that was absolutely nothing compared to the absolute joy and ecstasy these Chinese kids were feeling. You got to remember that most Chinese people up until the 20th century rarely, if ever, left their hometown. Maybe they got to travel around their home province if they were lucky. This was these kids' big chance to finally leave their hometowns and see the world, see Beijing, and most importantly, see Chairman Mao in person. Maybe even meet him in person, like a lot of kids got to do at the end of each rally. And, you know, these trips weren't entirely tedious, disease-filled, stinky sardine cans. I mean, yeah, they were, but like the whole time, kids would be up late into the night studying Marxist theory, writing poetry, composing and singing revolutionary songs, helping each other memorize Mao's quotations, making lifelong friendships, and, let me tell you, more than just a little hanky-panky happened on those revolutionary networking train trips. Bow chicka bow wow. No, seriously. Girls would often come back to their hometowns pregnant from the Red Guard rallies they'd attended in Beijing. And a lot of young people would have their first queer experiences with each other. Lots of, exploring and experimenting happened in those top bunks. But I mean, you put a bunch of 16 to 20-year-olds onto a train, no contraceptives, no parents, no chaperones, no party secretaries or commissars to keep track of any immoral or antisocial behaviors. High schoolers and college kids are going to get their freak on, you know? And I mean, when I was in the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade as a kid, and when we go on protest trips to DC or NYC during the height of the anti-Iraq war movement or anti-globalization movement, we did what hormonal young people would do. So why would the Red Guards in China be any different? Okay, getting my mind out of the gutter now. Although I will come back to this subject in the future episode, sex and sexuality during the Cultural Revolution. In all seriousness, folks, the revolutionary networking train trips were a very special thing which allowed the rebel youth movement to consolidate itself in a very intimate way by being among each other and literally having days to do nothing but take part in unity, form new rebel coalitions, and sharpen their understanding of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought, as well as quash some of the beefs between local factions in some of the farther out provincial capitals and lower tier universities and high schools. Eventually, after the main Red Guard rallies were over in November of 1966, the Red Guards left Beijing, and instead of going straight back home, the revolutionary networking movement began to spill out all over China to foment the rebellion even further, particularly in the rural areas. Still, despite the amazing achievements made by the revolutionary networking and the consolidation of the rebel movements in the province around a Marxist-Leninist line, the rampage against China's historical heritage went completely unchecked. And it seemed to just get worse every time a new batch of Red Guards disembarked from a revolutionary networking train or bus. This is when Mao and the CCRG decided to call for the October Party Conference, an unusually long and intense party plenary that lasted from October 9th to 28th. Where for 19 days the Central Committee debated whether it was time to pull back the Red Guards as the shock troops of the Cultural Revolution and start unleashing different sectors of society to keep the Cultural Revolution's momentum going further, particularly the urban working class. Originally, the October Party Conference was supposed to be nothing but a 3-day Central Committee workshop that was going to address the problem of mid-level cadres obstructing the Cultural Revolution from developing further. However, as more and more criticisms were raised, the debate went on longer and got more and more heated. When the third day ended, Mao, who was originally not supposed to attend, called the Central Committee back for a longer plenary. The next day began with Lin Biao tearing into what he called the bourgeois reactionary line opposing Mao's line, with it being quite obvious who Lin was referring to. On the 16th, Chen Boda delivered a report, edited by Mao, called The Two Lines in the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, that emphasized the Cultural Revolution being a primarily two-line struggle. Chen specifically criticized Tan Lifu's bloodline theory, popular among Red Guard factions, many Red Guard factions that is, as being revisionist and idealist, and said that there were still a great deal of resistance to the Cultural Revolution from loyalist Red Guard factions pretending to be rebels, not including the Picket Corps and the Scarlet Guards. On the 23rd, Liu Shaoqi caved in and once again admitted to, quote, serious errors and said that he had committed right opportunism against the first 50 days of the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping spoke after Liu and also issued a self-criticism, confessing, quote, I was following the bourgeois reactionary line, and he declared, quote, if only I had listened to Chairman Mao. In response, the propaganda department declared a nationwide ban on the sale of Liu Shaoqi's How to Be a Good Communist, which had been originally considered one of the cornerstone theoretical works of Chinese communism. Things really heated up on the morning of the 25th, however, when Red Guard-aligned rebel party members stormed the Zhongnong High leadership compound and demanded that Liu and Deng be sacked from the party immediately. Politburo member and Mao loyalist Tao Ju met with the mob and told them that he did not approve and for them to leave so that the meeting could continue and the Central Committee could decide democratically what to do with Liu and Deng. Meanwhile, Mao sat with the work conference attendees and struck a more conciliatory tone. Who wants to topple you? He asked all those in attendance. I don't. I don't think most Red Guards do either. It's wrong to blame everything on Liu and Deng. It's my fault too. I gave them too much power. Still, the conference was not about to let the rightists off the hook. Lin spoke up again after Mao sat down and said that the triumph of revisionism in the Soviet Union is the exact reason that China needs the Cultural Revolution. Capitalist cultural and old ideas of Russian traditionalism outlived Stalin and opened the door for Khrushchev's rise, he said. Lin then turned to Liu and Deng and said directly to them, "The line of Mao Zedong will triumph over the Liu-Deng line because it is the truth." The work conference ended with a final summation that it was time to expand the Cultural Revolution away from the students and out to the broader sections of society. Not to pull the plug on the Red Guard movement completely, no, not at all. That was still a long ways away. But simply a broadening of the rebel movement into the workers, peasants, soldiers, and intellectuals. Mao was especially intrigued with the reports coming out of Shanghai of spontaneous rebel actions by urban workers, and the work of Red Guard organized peasants in the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture in Jilin province, and thus he saw such reports as a sign that it was time for the revolution to branch out. On the 28th, Zhou Enlai officially closed the October Party conference, but warned the rightist attendees to watch their backs. Red Guards might abduct them on their way home from the conference, and the party center couldn't be held responsible for what might happen to them. I should note that this October conference didn't put a freeze to the Red Guard movement. Outside the walls of Zhongnong High, things were still marching forward. The October 1st National Day Parade was converted from the standard PLA military parade into yet another Red Guard rally. And 2 more Red Guard rallies were held during the conference on the 10th and the 18th, each one gathering somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million attendees. In Fuzhou, in Fujian province, a rally of 30,000 plus minority faction Red Guards occupied the city center and called for the Fuzhou Party Committee to be toppled. Beijing Normal University Sports Stadium filled up with a coalition of various rebel groups' delegates who held a rally calling for the overthrow of the Beijing Party Committee, where they forced Beijing Party Chief Li Shuifeng to make a self-criticism for being too soft on pro-Liu and pro-Deng elements within the Municipal Party Committee. At Beida, Dazabaos covering the entire campus were saying, "Liu Shaoqi is China's Khrushchev," a slogan that would quickly become one of the rallying cries of the Red Guard movement until Liu's death in prison a few years later. A few days later, Beida Red Guards posted another major Dazabao. Deng Xiaoping is also China's Khrushchev. He upholds the capitalist ideal that it does not matter whether a cat is a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice. How foreboding, because indeed, after the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, that very slogan would become the driving idea behind the reform and opening up. Regardless, despite the whirlwind of vandalism, factionalism, and juicy intrigue behind closed doors, the Cultural Revolution showed no signs of collapsing inward, and all signs pointing to the movement only gaining more and more momentum and militancy across the autumn. On October 31st, 1966, Mao sat down with a group of PLA commanders and said pointedly, "The army's job is still to maintain stability in China, but it should not be insulated from the great proletarian cultural revolution much longer." What could Mao have meant by that? What was next for the PLA? Who would win out? And who would fall from grace over the next 10 years? Well, we'll cross those bridges when we come to it across the series. So before I wrap things up, let's see, we're already into about the 45-minute mark, but I think I want to say some extra things, if you guys may allow me to get more into the nitty-gritty. Because that's what you're here for, right? The nitty-gritty. So the other night, I was talking with a comrade who was a scholar of the Cultural Revolution the other day. You guys might know him by one of his pen names, Alan Jordan. He's been featured in Negation magazine, and he and I made some interesting points while we were chopping it up, like we often do over DM on Twitter. We were talking about how across September through December of '66, the shift from solely student rebellion to gradually more and more worker mobilization seems somewhat improvised. Now, as I've told you guys before in earlier episodes, the workers in the left wing of the intelligentsia, like Nie Wanzi, and the PLA were facts active in the first few months of the Cultural Revolution, but on a very minor level and almost entirely confined to the city of Beijing, except for incidents in Shanghai, like when factory worker Wang Hongwen put up his own famous Dazabao against the bourgeois reactionary line in October of '66, or when urban workers went around and on their own Red Guard-style looting spree against suspicious households. My comrade and I kind of threw around an idea, though, that around this point, the CCRG began to think that the attacks on ancient cultural institutions and historical sites by the students and the unpredictable violence, particularly that of the middle schoolers and high schoolers, proved an ineffective tool at breaking the power of the conservative bureaucracy centered around Liu and Deng. I mean, yeah, it was helping somewhat, can't deny that. But I think they were beginning to realize it could only go so far and would never be able to deal the fatal blow needed to swing the party back to the left and onto the socialist road. Another thing that it seems like the CCRG were concerned about was the possibility of a disruption of the economy that could have caused China to completely collapse. And it seemed the student movement was almost entirely ignoring Mao's directives about grasp revolution, promote production, in favor of entirely concentrating on nothing but destroy the four olds, or taking up semi-anarchistic slogans such as overthrow everything. Furthermore, Allen said to me, quote, "It'd be interesting to know a more exact proportion or to have a more quantitative analysis of workers' participation during autumn of '66, because the impression that I keep getting is that it was more of a trickle from the workers at first. In Shanghai, though, a number of Red Guard groups were in direct contact with the workers' unions that would eventually consolidate into the Shanghai Rebel Worker General Headquarters, for example. And yeah, things started picking up faster within the workers' movement, especially after the October conference. The conference was really the beginning of the segue between the Red Guard explosion of August 1966 and the workers' activism of December of 1966 through February of '67. Because the whole point of the conference was repudiating the bourgeois reactionary line of the conservative cadres resisting the student radicals, the work teams that had suppressed them on campus, and so forth. And the paralysis of the party state by fall of '66 really made for an opening for a widening of political activity from just the students to the workers, peasants, and soldiers in other sectors of society." End quote. While I might not be 100% on the same page as Allen, he and I have our differences in interpretations, I definitely think he has a major point when he talks about the importance of the October Party Conference as one of the main segues between the student movement and the broader explosion of the Cultural Revolution that would lead to the power seizures in January and February of '67. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because we still need to talk about November and early December of '66 in episode 6, because that's where we see things get even crazier, especially in places like Shanghai. Well, folks, that's about it for September and October of 1966. Next month, we'll reach November, where we'll be discussing the shrieking crescendo of the Destroy the Four Olds campaign with the destruction of Confucius's tomb and the Ming tombs around Beijing, the final Red Guard rallies in Tiananmen, and most excitingly, the founding of the Shanghai Workers' Revolutionary Rebel General Headquarters, all of which will be foreshadowing for the January storm of 1967. Oh, and watch out for the December episode, because we just might have not one, but two very special guests to help us tell the story of the closing weeks of '66. Stay tuned. Well, anyways, do we have a corrections corner this month? No? Well, seems like we don't. That's good, of course. No risk of me getting airplane and struggle sessioned by my listeners. Seriously, though, love you guys more and more with each episode. Always appreciate when you guys correct my slip-ups. 好的，同志们, thanks so much, 谢谢, for listening in once again as always. Until next time, from the ancient city of Xi'an, 再见. If you guys have any comments, corrections, or criticisms, send them my way at culturalrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com or my Twitter account at GPCRpodcast. And as always, keep marching forward, be resolute, fear no sacrifice, and surmount every difficulty to win victory. Special thanks once again to Andrew G. Walder for Fractured Rebellion, the Beijing Red Guard Movement, particularly chapters 5 and 6, as well as his text Agents of Disorder Inside China's Cultural Revolution, particularly chapters 5 through 8. Proletarian Power, Shanghai and the Cultural Revolution by Elizabeth Perry and Li Shun, particularly chapter 1. The Banned Thought website for its extensive archive of Peking Review issues and other Mao-era Chinese literature, particularly Peking Review issues numbers 36 through 44. The Wilson Center Digital Archives China Cultural Revolution Database. The PRC Digital Group's Academic Journal Remembrance, issue number 156, May 31st, 2016. And, of course, the Marxist Internet Archive Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism Online. Once again, thank you guys, and I will catch you next time, sometime at the end of November. All right, 再见.